You're listening to episode 325 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Koshin Paley Ellison joins us to speak about his new book, Wholehearted: Slow Down, Help Out, Wake Up. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I want to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Buddhism may sometimes be seen as disconnected. There's a meme of a monk removed from the world, high on a mountaintop, but there is some gem of truth to that when one considers the extinguishing of craving and narratives in the Paley canon of equanimity that, from our perspective, may seem quite cold, an ending to intimacy, especially with one's self. Sensei Koshin Paley Ellison co-founded the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, the first Zen-based organization to offer fully accredited ACPE clinical chaplaincy training in America. He has served as the co-director of contemplative care services for the Department of Integrative Medicine and as the chaplaincy supervisor for the Pain and Palliative Care Department at Mount Sinai Beth Israel Medical Center, where he also served on the Medical Ethics Committee. He is currently on the faculty of the University of Arizona Medical School's Center for Integrative Medicine's Integrative Medicine Fellowship, and he's a visiting professor at the McGovern Center for Humanities and Ethics of the University of Texas Health Science Center of Houston Medical School. He serves on the board of directors at the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care and Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. So sit back, relax, have a nice lazy river tea. Our guest today is Koshin Paley Ellison, and if you hear it in my voice that I'm smiling, it's because I just so adore this man. Thank you so much for being here, Koshin. Nice to see you again.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ted.
So it's been a while since we've last spoken. Listeners of the podcast may recall episode 260 in October of 2016. Goodness gracious. Where you and Chodo were guests of us talking about Awake at the Bedside. And now we have something new to talk about. You have a more recent book. But before we get to there, it has been a while. It's been about 3 years. So I'm wondering if you might take a few minutes and just catch up on what you've been up to, what's been happening the past few years.
Wow. To consider reflecting on the last 3 years, what comes to mind is the growth of our community here and how there's, we have these different aspects to our community where there are people who come here for Zen training and some people come here for contemplative care training. And it's just been so beautiful to see so many people deeply engaging in service and really integrating and building an integrated life where their spiritual life and their service are under the umbrella of curiosity, investigation, and receptivity. And so it's just been, and today I was telling you that we just finished, a one group of chaplains, contemplative chaplains just finished their accredited training, 400 hours. So it just was a celebration and so moving to see these people keep showing up. And that's so much about the work. And the center here, the New York Zen Center, has just kept growing over the last 3 years. And we continue to be serving, offering an extra layer of spiritual and emotional support to about 10,000 people a year. And so doing that direct care and talking about our education programs keep growing. And I guess what's also happened in the last 3 years is Chodo and I now are teaching more internationally. We've always been teaching in several different medical schools, and we've been teaching fairly regularly in Japan once a year. And this year we're going back and teaching in Kyoto University. And it's just an amazing opportunity. And teaching there has been so inspiring because our tradition comes from Japan. Originally, of course, from India, then to China, Japan, but it's incredible to go there and to be teaching, these two Western Zen monks going back to Japan to help them integrate how to their own tradition that comes from there and how to integrate it into an integrated life, into integrated healthcare, and how to really work with resilience. And so it feels, again, like just privilege after privilege to be able to have these experiences that are so humbling and tender.
I'm curious, Koshin, one of the things that you mentioned is this integration. And what are some of the things that you're seeing? What are some of the challenges that people are running into in integrating Buddhist thought practices into their lives? And especially knowing that this has been part of their heritage culture. And is there this kind of appetite for what it is in this offering?
Well, the amazing thing that we see in Japan, that we see, we also teach clinicians across the country here. And what's heartbreaking is that they are having the same kinds of struggles there. And, the pandemic of social isolation that we live in at this time, where people are so isolated, and in particular physicians, it's one of the most unhealthy professions currently, because there's the highest rates of suicide and drug abuse, and it's heartbreaking. So what was surprising is how similar it is in Japan and how not different. And at the same time, I'm thinking about this one woman who we were training, and she was a physician, and she was talking about that she hadn't looked at one of her patients in about 25 years in the eye, and how burnt out she was. And she was also a meditator, but she didn't know what that had to do with the relationship. So over the course of, we were doing a 8-week training with this group of attending physicians, she realized, actually part of the training, she remembered why she stopped looking at the patients. And she was in obstetrics and, mother babies. That's what she thought, like, this is going to be wonderful. But her first patient in her private practice was, she had to tell a woman that, and her partner, that the child inside of her was dead. And she just wasn't prepared for that.
Yeah.
And she hadn't been trained to have that conversation. She hadn't been trained to how to be so uncomfortable and proceed. And so she said, like, that was the last time she looked at one of her patients. And what she began to do is learning how to, through both the practice of meditation as well as the teachings, taking refuge in awakening and receptivity and connection. You know, this is one of the ways that I'm reimagining the three treasures. And she began to understand, like, actually, that it felt good to look at her patients again. And even if what she had to tell them was not so welcome, that she could be welcoming and be with them in what was unwelcome.
So there's a whole gap in her training, in her medical training, compassion, and that nourishment one can get from compassion, even difficulties. And then in her meditation practice, that it sounds like there's a lot of isolating grooves to unpack and unravel.
Well, it was also so interesting. You know, I think she's a great person to talk about because she was very interested in addressing these issues. And she knew how burnt out she was. She knew her lack of resilience. So she was doing all this self-care work and self-compassion training, but that didn't help. It actually made her feel more isolated. And so there's this big movement in the medical field towards, you know, self-care, and now self-compassion is the next wave of that. And what we've been seeing is that, again, this is anecdotal, but across the board is that it makes people feel more isolated because it's, again, like self-compassion. Oh, I'm not good at my self-compassion, as opposed to like, hey, Ted, look at you. And can we be here together? You know, I think that, you know, how do we learn how to be awake where we are and be loving in relationships? And actually, in my experience, and that lights up the pleasure centers of the brain. When we feel that we can be with another person in our suffering, their suffering, and we can say, I'm with you.
Well,
like,
and as
that
you know,
actually feels good.
Yeah, and as you know from your work, it can be some of the most rewarding for you to possibly do. You mentioned that years ago in our conversation, is that this is one of the best things you could be doing with your life. So what else during this past 3 years? You mentioned some other things happening too.
Yeah, so Awake at the Bedside, which is the book that came out a couple of years ago, which was this book that I love very much, and it's like all these different voices of people, doctors and Buddhist teachers around end-of-life care. And that came out, and it still is supporting people in really interesting ways. And I still get really beautiful letters from like a woman who is taking care of her mother in rural Germany in the mountains, like, and how the book is feeling like a really amazing companion. Mm-hmm. So that is still serving. And then, you know, the publisher approached me about writing a book. And I said, well, I don't really want to work on something alone, because I actually had stopped writing in 2002 when I had really been a writer before then. When my grandmother died, I just didn't have a desire to write anymore. And so the publisher said, well, what would you need to do this book? And I said, well, someone to collaborate with and an editor who would be very hands-on. And I got to choose this amazing person, Emma Vakulis, and she's a wonderful person and a fabulous editor. And so we got to work each week, and I got to think about, well, what I wanted to write about. And one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about in this age, as I've been talking about it, is loneliness and isolation. And so I wanted to write a book for my target audience was my mother and my niece. And not that either of them are particularly socially isolated, but I wanted to write a book that they would be able to understand easily. And they're both wonderful people who are kind of Buddhist curious, mindfulness curious. But I felt like there's these 16 precepts, these ethical guidelines that help and support me every day. And I wanted to talk about them in a way that would help them and be accessible to them. And because I feel like the Buddhist teachings are so amazing and so available. And so that's what we began to do, is to like really look at how do we really examine how to have a wholehearted life. And a wholehearted life can't be lived in isolation. And so the tagline of the book is slow down, help out, wake up. And many people ask me the question like, well, why is wake up at the end? And for me, like until we really slow down and actually help out, which is really about being in relationship with others in the world, that's how we wake up. When we actually are in service of where we are. And so writing that book was so exciting because I felt the love of writing and the love of language again. So since that book just came out, I started almost immediately working on some new material, which is actually going to be the next book. So it's amazing and it's so joyful. And working with Emma again, and I love just being in relationship, I realized, so like to do things together is so much fun because we have this one shot in this life. And I want to make sure that I'm working and being as loving and present as I can be.
So let's talk a little bit about what's in the book. I mean, that's a broad and deep look at some of the aspirations behind it, some of the art that's behind it. And it's so nice to hear about the value of connection, and whether that's connection with others, connection with oneself, with one's surroundings, what's going around us. And it's so wonderful to hear because to me, that's always been more what this practice has been of benefit to me in my life, is that opening, that heart opening and that mind opening and that connecting, rather than the isolation, navel gazing stuff. It's like, not so much that never felt quite it, but that the tremendous value of it was coming through connection. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit about how you describe what is meant by connection. How do people recognize it when it's present? How is it something that we can foster and nurture in our lives?
There's this great Sangha member of our community Randy Brown is his name, and he said to me, Koshin, what's all this teaching about? Like, I feel like you keep, kind of going around it, but I think what you're saying is it's all about experiencing what you're experiencing while you're experiencing it. And I thought that is a great way of describing connection. Because if I'm not really experiencing what I'm experiencing while it's happening, I'm not going to be able to be with you.
That's the definition of disconnected.
Right. And I think that, I just love the way he described it and using experiencing 3 times in different ways. And I think that is kind of what's required. Or my teacher, Diane, says that, it just takes total willingness to really show up. And so how do I, offer my total willingness to show up? And so connection to me is that willingness to be in relationship with whoever is there. And it takes everything, really. And The other day, someone came to me because they were very afraid about what was happening in Iran. And they said, I found out that like if there was a nuclear war, we'd have 30 minutes. And now I'm afraid. And of course, we can understand that fear, right? And at the same time, I thought, yeah, we have 30 minutes. And how do we want to be in that 30 minutes? To me, one of the things about intimacy and connection is we have this one shot. I mean, it's so extraordinary how we have this one shot. And how do we want to be in it? How do we want to live our life? How do I want to be here with you? And how do I want to imagine, wow, our words are going to be listened to by other people? And how do I want to appreciate that as we're talking? And so can I be as helpful as I can be and knowing I might kind of miss the mark, and that's okay too. And yet be willing to consider the multi-directions of all of my actions. And to realize like, wow, how I'm talking is going to affect you and it'll affect who knows who else. But to really wonder about that. How do I wonder about, wow, things ripple out. We see this, just in the newspaper. You see an event in the newspaper and how it ripples out. Or in a meditation space, we were just in a group the other day and someone was saying to someone else in the group that, wow, I saw you the first time I came to this Zen center, and the way you walked across the room inspired me to commit to my practice. How amazing is that? So like
sense of wonder that itself can be inspiring by just noticing and reflecting what are those potential ripples with that little tiny pebble.
It's so extraordinary. I mean, to me, that's where connection is, like how we walk across a room, inspired another person to practice for many years and continues to. And I think that that's what we forget. Like, it's not often what we say, but it's how we are in our own bodies. The other day, a friend of mine is teaching a class. And when I first met her, I thought, wow, she's extraordinary. I just saw her sitting on a couch. And you could just tell, I could tell, like, she's like so comfortable in herself. She was so there in her own body and in the room, and I think that we often, part of intimacy and connection too, is actually, are we actually, again, going back to experiencing what we're experiencing while we're experiencing it? Our own inhabiting and embodying where we are is actually mostly what we communicate, because 85% or something like that of communication is nonverbal anyway. And so what most people are experiencing and what we mostly remember is not what someone says, but how they were. And so the book in some ways is to, around these 16 teachings, but it's also about how do you really keep turning the jewel and looking at all the facets of how we're all responsible and the joy of responsibility.
Yeah. You also talk in the book about values, and I'm wondering if we might explore that a little bit, that why that's important. How do people even get in touch with what their values are, and and live in accord with those values?
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure, but I think that most people, if you pause them and say, I have a serious question for you. What do you value most? Most people are often surprised by the question. I've asked actually some of the guys who go to my gym this question in the locker room. You can try it out. And most of them were pretty thrown by the question because of the context of the locker room. But it was great because actually they all said, most of them said love, family, health, well-being, that those are the things they value the most. And then when you ask them the qualities, it's usually love. So whatever it is for you, how do you then reflect on wow, how is my day going? And does it match? And how does it match or not match to what is actually happening? It's so interesting to think about it. The other day we were talking about stealing, and I was thinking about, there's this precept called non-stealing and not taking what's not given. And it's pretty amazing to think about all the moments I was thinking about from 5 a.m. when I usually get up to go sit and then do different things. I go to the gym and then different things. How I turned away from someone subtly because I was busy doing something else, even though I could tell they were in distress. And these ways of stealing and not living in my own values in subtle ways. And to me, the key part of that kind of reflection is having embarrassment about it and not shaming ourselves for it, but to kind of also even have a sense of humor and taking responsibility. It's a story I love very much about that, where the Zen cook is the high level cook, and maybe you know the story. I don't know. It's and the lunch was almost ready, and it was going to be served to all the monks. And he realized that he forgot the soup, and so he goes out with a scythe and cuts up a bunch of vegetables, puts them in a pot, miso soup or something, and then just in time, all the servers go out to deliver the soup. And the abbot of the monastery lifts up his spoon, and on the spoon is a snake head. And he bows and asks the head cook to come. And so the head cook marches up to the platform where the abbot is, and he bows to the abbot and takes the snake head from the abbot's spoon, pops it in his mouth, crunch, crunch, bows again, and goes away. And they bowed to each other. I love this story because of the attitude about responsibility. There he is, the head cook had killed the snake and served it to the abbot of the temple. And the abbot is just showing him what he did without shaming him for what he did. He takes responsibility and eats it. And I feel like that is such an amazing story about responsibility and living in one's values. To wow, what would it be like to just do that? To just eat what you've done, crunch, crunch, and keep going. This past Sunday, there was a huge march in New York, a huge rally, march to end hate and anti-Semitism. And we were all the people who showed up, the Buddhist Action Coalition, lots of Jewish groups, all these different people showed up, but like 30, 40,000 people. And they had everyone kind of pinned in this Foley Square before they marched. We were all going to march over the Brooklyn Bridge into Brooklyn. And around the kind of gated in area were all these cops with machine guns. So kind of encircling the gated area. And on some of the rooftops, there were snipers. And this woman, she was 87 from Baltimore, who was next to me, was so afraid. And she said, I know that they're here to protect us. But the feeling of being a bunch, all the Jews corralled in the middle of a square, surrounded by people in uniforms with guns, terrifies me. And it was just so powerful to hear her say that. And then she said, and it's exactly why I'm here. And I wouldn't miss walking over that bridge and showing up. And so to me, like, that is living with your values. She was so inspiring. She was so afraid and doing it anyway. She was like, there she was meeting her edge. I was scared too. It was scary. And it was so great because like so many of us meet those moments and say, I'm going to go home. I can't deal with this. Yeah. Or I'm scared to go to a rally like that because what if X, Y, Z? Or I don't want to have this conversation with my partner or my coworker or whoever because I'm uncomfortable or I'm scared. And it was so amazing to receive this teaching from her. And just she was so clear. And talk about living in accord with your values. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. And to me, like, that was exactly like this inspired moment of fearlessness. Yeah.
Or living in fear and doing it anyway.
Which to me is what fearlessness is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like feeling your fear completely and keep going.
Yeah. So on the keep going, I'm wondering about what kinds of hurdles you've encountered that people have to finding that open intimacy with themselves, with their values.
The main hurdles I experience in thinking about people that I meet on the road teaching is that many people feel like that their problems, that no one will understand them. That we, in this culture of social isolation, we use our marks of suffering as ways to justify our isolation. Or at least that's the main habit. And so what I've seen is that people tell me often these kind of stories of these private shames or this concealment that they feel like they have to conceal who they really are. Because if anyone really knew them, they would cast them out. And it's critical to remember the Buddha's teaching. That there was something that he realized was that we all experience suffering. I mean, the Four Noble Truths are the most extraordinary medicine in general, maybe. But I think what's so amazing too is, they're about 88 generations old, so maybe about 2,600 years. Whether the Buddha existed or not doesn't really matter. Like some person or groups of people came up with these amazing teachings. And if we realize like, oh, wow, for 88 generations, people have been practicing with this reality. that, wow, life has real difficulties. And that actually I get caught in those by my greed and my resentments and my delusions that I'm the only one. The delusion of separateness, that no one will understand me. And it's so heartbreaking. And yet then the pivot can happen. The way out happens when we realize, like, oh, when I share with you, you know what I'm really struggling with? I'm struggling with feeling like you won't like me if I tell you really what I feel. And that's what pivots us out. And then there's a path that the Buddha laid out about, like, wow, it's really about awareness and compassion and wisdom. How do we function? How do we live with those qualities? And again, it's such a marvelous place of reflection to, like, really think about, like, wow, how am I doing? Do my thoughts, words, and actions actually match my values? Or they're, like, really off? It's such an interesting question.
Yeah. And that area of exploration is where that tremendous shift in awareness can come.
Big time.
Yeah. What else do you want to share with the listeners, whether it's about the book or anything else that you want to give?
You know, our lineage comes through Taizama Izumi Roshi, and he always ended his talks with saying, just like, please appreciate your life. And now to me, like, I offer Izumi Roshi's teaching about appreciating our lives, because we're here for, like the Diamond Sutra says, like a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud. Like, wow, this is it. So to appreciate the vividness of what is here, whatever joy, whatever sorrow, this is it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. For those listening, of course, our guest today, Koshin Paley Ellison, I will have a link to zencare.org, or you could just go there yourself. You know the address now, but there will be a link, as well as links to the newest book, Wholehearted, Slow Down, Help Out, Wake Up. And the previous book, I'll put that on there as well, Awake at the Bedside. Thank you, Koshin, so much for being here. Good to speak with you again.
A joy to be with you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.